Number 8, the seen but not heard rule. Ever notice how some adults apologize before speaking? Like, sorry, this might be stupid, but that's not humility, that's programming. And it usually started before you could even spell confidence. Because for a lot of us, childhood came with one unspoken law: be quiet, don't disturb. We assume kids grow up learning to express themselves. After all, school had show and tell, right? But here's the trick. Most of that expression was filtered, graded, or scolded. Your thoughts had to be cute, safe, or classroom appropriate. Teachers prized obedience, not authenticity. Parents prized silence, not questions. And while no one said the words out loud, the vibe was clear. Your value comes from not taking up too much space. If you learned early that speaking up got you shushed, scolded, or ignored, then being invisible became a survival strategy. Psychologists studying childhood emotional neglect, or CEN, found that when kids grow up without their feelings acknowledged, they carry the habit of self-erasure into adulthood. You learn to edit yourself, to shrink, to swallow needs before they escape your mouth. Historically, mid-20th century America doubled down on this. The seen but not heard child was considered well-behaved. Silence equaled good parenting. And today, you meet that same kid at work. The colleague who never speaks up in meetings, the friend who says, "I'm fine," through obvious pain, the partner who can't ask for comfort because needing feels selfish. It's not that these adults don't want connection, it's that they were trained for decades that connection requires silence. So if you've ever wondered why it's hard to just say what you feel, it's because you were punished for trying. And it only gets lonelier from here, especially once other kids get involved.
Number 7, bullying as a social blueprint. Remember being told, don't take it personally, kids can be mean. Here's the plot twist. You did take it personally, and your brain never really forgot. Childhood bullying wasn't just playground cruelty, it was social training. It taught you, in front of everyone, that belonging is conditional, fragile, and easily revoked. We like to imagine bullying is just a childhood phase, something you grow out of, like braces or boy bands. Adults will say, oh, everyone had a rough time in middle school, but not everyone learned the same lesson. For the bullied kid, rejection wasn't an event, it was a rehearsal. Every shove in the hallway or whispered insult was a quiet reminder that closeness carries risk, that laughter can turn on you instantly, that groups are dangerous. So, by adulthood, avoiding vulnerability isn't random, it's muscle memory. The CDC found that kids who experience bullying are far more likely to struggle with social anxiety, trust, and depression later in life. Think about it. If your earliest experiments with friendship ended in humiliation, why would you bet big on intimacy as an adult? And American culture hasn't exactly helped. In the 80s and 90s, schools brushed off bullying with "kids will be kids." Translation, survival of the socially fittest. Fast forward to adulthood and it looks familiar, doesn't it? Office politics, cliquey friend groups, social media pile-ons. The playground just got rebranded with HR emails and Instagram filters. The rules didn't change, they scaled, which means every harmless childhood memory you've shoved aside might still be shaping how close you let people get. So, if connection feels unsafe, it might be because your first blueprint for friendship was betrayal, and it only gets trickier when your own family starts treating you like their therapist.
Number 6, parentification, when you became the parent. What if I told you your loneliness isn't because you're bad at relationships, but because you were too good at them as a kid? Sounds backwards, right? But if you grew up as the family peacemaker, therapist, or many parents, you didn't learn closeness, you learned responsibility. And responsibility doesn't hug you back. Most people think childhood is about being carefree, running around outside, and making mud pies. But for a lot of kids, childhood meant keeping the family stable. Maybe you managed your parents' moods. Maybe you looked after siblings while mom worked double shifts. Maybe you learned to read the room before you could read a book. Adults call this being mature for your age. But here's the trick. Maturity wasn't a gift, it was a job. And when kids have to act like adults too soon, they often grow into adults who never learned how to just be. Psychologists call this parentification, when a child takes on roles meant for the parent. Research shows it's linked to anxiety, guilt, and struggles with intimacy later in life. because when you're trained to manage others' needs, your own feels selfish. Historically, post-war America glorified the resilient kid who grew up fast. Families in crisis leaned on their eldest children like unpaid counselors. And culturally, we still romanticize it. She raised her brothers after her dad left, is said like a badge of honor. But the hidden cost is staggering. These kids grow up believing connection means caretaking, that love is something you earn by serving, not something you're allowed to receive, which is why so many adults feel exhausted in relationships yet unable to ask for support. If you grew up playing therapist in your own living room, no wonder intimacy feels like work. But sometimes the problem wasn't hidden roles, it was hidden violence behind closed doors.
Number 5. Abuse behind closed doors. Here's a dark truth. Some of the loneliest adults are the ones who grew up in the happiest families on the block. The lawn was mowed, the smiles were staged for church. But inside the house, abuse, silence, and fear were teaching lessons no child should ever learn. We like to believe abuse is rare, or at least obvious, but the reality? Millions of kids grew up navigating a minefield of shouting, hitting, or worse, all while pretending everything was normal at school the next day. And when adults asked, "How are you?" the answer had to be, "Fine." Abuse doesn't just bruise the body, it rewires the brain. Kids learn that closeness equals danger, that trust equals betrayal, that love can flip into violence in the span of a single slammed door. The famous Adverse Childhood Experiences study showed that children exposed to physical, emotional, or sexual abuse are far more likely to struggle with intimacy, mental health, and social isolation as adults. Because if the people who were supposed to protect you instead hurt you, your nervous system encodes safety as a fantasy. Historically, American culture made things worse. For decades, family matters were considered private, even when bruises were visible. Schools, neighbors, even churches often turned a blind eye. Fast forward to adulthood, and many survivors live in two modes: hyper-independent because relying on others feels unsafe, or overly anxious in relationships because abandonment feels inevitable. Abuse doesn't just scar childhood, it plants a seed of mistrust that blossoms into adult loneliness, even when you desperately want connection. So, if intimacy feels like walking on eggshells, you might just be reliving the lessons of your childhood home. And as if that weren't enough, sometimes loneliness starts with simply packing boxes. Number 4. The friend who moved away. Remember when your best friend suddenly moved away? One day you're trading baseball cards or whispering secrets at a sleepover, and the next, gone. New town, new school, new people. Adults called it just moving. But for a kid, it was a masterclass in loss. And that lesson doesn't fade. We think kids are resilient, that they'll bounce back from change. And sure, kids adapt, they make new friends, join new classes, survive. But here's the quiet truth. Every time a childhood bond ended in a moving van, kids learned that closeness is temporary, that people leave, that no matter how deep a friendship feels, it can be packed into boxes overnight. In a culture where mobility is celebrated, better jobs, better neighborhoods, better schools, kids absorb the hidden cost. Relationships are fragile. Studies show children who moved frequently are more likely to struggle with weaker social ties in adulthood. In the U.S., especially post-1970s, economic instability and job transfers kept families in constant motion. Sociologists call it residential mobility, but for a child, it feels like emotional whiplash. The friend who disappears isn't just a memory, it's proof that attachment is risky. Fast forward, and many adults carry that script. They keep friendships casual, avoid deep commitment, or ghost before being ghosted. Because if you internalize that connection ends abruptly, why bet your heart on permanence? Ironically, the adults who crave stability the most often struggle to trust it because childhood trained them that stability was always borrowed time. So if closeness feels fragile, you might just be reliving childhood moving day.
Number 3. Religion, gender, and shame. Here's a cruel trick. Kids often felt lonely, even in the middle of communities designed to protect them. Churches, schools, even family dinners. Because instead of teaching belonging, those spaces often taught shame, especially if who you were, your feelings, desires, or identity didn't fit the script. Most adults look back at childhood religion or cultural rules as strict but harmless.
But for kids who didn't fit perfectly, who questioned, who felt different, who broke the rules, belonging turned into exile. Maybe it was purity culture, making you feel dirty for normal curiosity. Maybe it was gender expectations, labeling you too soft or not man enough. Maybe it was simply being told that your feelings were sinful, wrong, or embarrassing. Kids in those environments didn't learn intimacy, they learned surveillance, how to monitor themselves so they wouldn't get caught. Psychologists like Brené Brown have shown how shame corrodes connection because shame says, if you really knew me, you'd leave. Research on LGBTQ+ youth, for example, shows higher rates of loneliness in adulthood, not just because of bullying, but because childhood trained them to hide core parts of themselves. Historically, American purity culture doubled down in the 80s and 90s, teaching kids that normal sexual development was dangerous. Add to that rigid gender roles, and millions of children learned early that parts of themselves had to be buried to belong. Fast forward, those kids become adults who feel lonely even in relationships because they're never fully present. They're always editing, always calculating, always performing safety instead of authenticity. So, if love feels conditional, maybe it's because childhood taught you belonging had strings attached, and if shame was the lock, poverty often became the invisible wall around the whole playground. Number 2, poverty's hidden tax. Here's something no one tells you. Loneliness has a price tag, literally. If you grew up poor, you probably remember the invitations you couldn't accept, birthday parties you skipped, field trips you missed, clothes you couldn't afford. Poverty didn't just limit money, it quietly stamped outsider on your social life. We assume childhood poverty only affects careers or opportunities later on. But the truth is, it also rewires belonging. Kids don't need to understand economics to know when they're different. They notice when their lunch looks cheaper, when they can't join the team because fees cost too much, when sleepovers feel impossible because home feels embarrassing. It's not just exclusion, it's social exile. And while middle-class culture celebrates childhood as carefree, kids in poverty learn something else. Friendship is conditional. You belong until money proves otherwise. Research shows children raised in poverty often carry higher risks of social withdrawal and loneliness as adults because when you're repeatedly left out as a child, exclusion starts to feel natural. And culturally, America made this worse by turning childhood status symbols, Nike shoes, birthday party venues, even Lunchables, into markers of worth. Kids who grew up poor weren't just missing resources, they were missing access to shared experiences. Fast forward, and those adults often feel like outsiders even when their bank account is stable. They might overcompensate with generosity or avoid social gatherings entirely, worried about not fitting in. Poverty's hidden tax isn't just financial, it's emotional. It teaches you early that belonging has a cover charge you might never afford. So if you've ever felt like connection is for other people, you might just be paying an old social debt. But even wealth can't fix the problem if no one modeled intimacy at home.
Number 1, no one modeled real connection. Here's a secret most people don't admit. We don't learn intimacy by accident. We copy it. We watch it. And if no one modeled closeness in your family, no hugs, no apologies, no vulnerability, you entered adulthood fluent in chores and schedules, but illiterate in connection. We imagine relationships are instinctual, that everyone just figures it out. But kids aren't born knowing how to communicate or repair after fights. They learn by watching the adults around them. And for many, the adults didn't provide much to copy. Maybe your parents never apologized. Maybe they never hugged. Maybe they lived like roommates instead of partners. So you grew up with the idea that closeness is awkward or even impossible. And the scariest part? Without a model, you didn't even realize what you were missing. Attachment theory, developed by John Bowlby, shows that kids internalize the emotional patterns they see at home. If parents respond with warmth, kids learn safety. If parents respond with distance or anger, kids learn avoidance. And in America's post-industrial hustle culture, emotional presence often got replaced with work obligations or numbing routines. Kids raised in that atmosphere didn't see intimacy modeled. So as adults, they stumble through relationships without a blueprint. They might default to surface-level chatter or retreat when conflict arises. Not out of malice, but because they never saw anyone handle closeness gracefully. It's like being handed car keys without ever watching someone drive. You want connection, but the mechanics are a mystery. So, if closeness feels unnatural, it might just be because no one ever showed you how. And when silence, shame, and scarcity pile up, they don't just shape relationships, they define adulthood itself. We think loneliness begins in adulthood, but most of its roots stretch back to childhood, in silences, losses, shaming rules, and roles we never chose. Each experience quietly rehearsed disconnection. Don't speak, don't trust, don't need. By the time we're grown, distance feels natural because it's familiar. The bigger truth, our culture rewarded survival over connection, leaving generations fluent in productivity but starved for intimacy. You're not broken, you were trained. Send this to someone who still wonders why closeness feels so hard.